few years back, I picked up my dream camera, the Leica M10. At the same time, I needed an everyday lens to go along with it. A 28mm lens is one of the most versatile focal lengths that can be used on a full frame camera. You have the ability to shoot a portrait of someone with a great amount of context and the ability to get wide landscapes without being forced to be too far away. Pair this with a fast aperture and you have the recipe for a lens that should deliver a great experience. I selected the 7artisans 28mm f1.4 for Leica M mount for my everyday carry because it seemed to check all the boxes. It's a wide angle 28mm with a super fast aperture that is over $7,000 cheaper than the Leica equivalent and can be adapted to basically any mirrorless camera on the market. My family and I recently took a 3-week trip all across Europe. This was the perfect opportunity to test this lens. I had never been more excited to use my camera, but there was a problem. I hated using it. Let's dive in, starting with the wide shots. Most lenses on the market will deliver decent results at a deeper f-stop like f4 and f8. I shot a lot of my wide cityscapes at f8 on this lens, and I was really impressed with how sharp they turned out. There were so many opportunities to see highly detailed buildings that were hundreds of years old, and I think this lens managed to represent them accurately. Reviewing the photos, I saw no notable issues with chromatic aberration at deeper f-stops, distortion is handled pretty well, and I was really happy with how neutral the color was from this lens. It gave photos an easy starting point for post-production. Medium shots in hindsight are where I found this lens the most versatile. This was really my first true test dailying a 28mm. Walking through narrow alleyways and passages, it felt like the correct point of view. It was never too wide, but I also never found myself needing to walk too close to anything to get the shot I saw in my head. At f1.4 to f2, images can feel a bit vintage with some hazy rendering in the center, which is a look I often embrace, but it's definitely not for everyone. The bokeh at wide stops falls off nicely, and you can get a bit of a swirly look to it with the right distance from your subject. Past f2.8, the lens starts to sharpen up and perform more similarly to a modern lens. If sharpness is super important to you, I'd recommend shooting this lens at f2.8 and above. I was happy that for the most part, close-up shots didn't feel like they had any distracting issues when it came to distortion. Vignetting was reasonable. In the right setting, this lens can be used in portrait-like situations with great results. Even wide open, close-up detail resolves much better than medium shots, and I was happy with some of the fun circle flares I got in a couple of my shots. Overall, I am pretty satisfied with the image quality of this lens at a price point of about $436 US. It's not cheap, but comparatively, it is a budget option that I think provides good value from an image quality standpoint. Build quality wise, this lens punches well above its price tag. The entire lens is made from metal and the aperturing is clicked for full stops. The filter thread is 52mm, which is relatively common, and the focus ring feels good. It's smooth in operation, but with just enough resistance that it isn't hard to get precise focus. On the lens mount, there is a brass coupler that you can calibrate so that when focusing with a rangefinder, like my M10, you can calibrate accurate focus in the viewfinder. My copy of this lens was slightly out of calibration right out of the box, and I didn't calibrate it before my trip, so shots I took using only the rangefinder on my trip were usually slightly out of focus, which was disappointing. If you plan on adapting this lens to a mirrorless camera, this isn't a step that you need to worry about. I was completely thrown off by how cumbersome this lens was. My setup swung around from the weight of the lens more than I would have liked, and it's a long enough lens that it's easy to accidentally knock on things if you're walking through tight spaces or a particularly crowded area. I hated carrying it around and started to dread bringing it with me every single day, which is a complete deal breaker for an everyday carry. The problem is, Leica cameras aren't very big, which is a feature, so when paired with a deceptively heavy lens like this one, you end up with an experience that is not very enjoyable as a daily carry, because it's not balanced well in the hand. You may not find this to be an issue if you're adapting this lens to a larger camera with a more significant grip than my M10. My issue with the weight of this lens was compounded by the challenge of traveling with my 1-year-old son. We were always on the move on this trip, changing cities every 2 days, so I was taking pictures in short bursts as we walked around without a lot of time to methodically compose and think of my shots the way I would if I was traveling alone. This was a fun challenge overall, but it was also why I found this lens to be impractical for my use. Despite liking the image quality of this lens, I didn't really use its main selling point. that wide f1.4 aperture. I found myself sticking to f2 as my widest stop, and I shot probably 80% of the photos on my trip at f8 because that made sense for the kinds of shots that I wanted. This meant I was carrying a lens that is twice as heavy as a lens that opens up to f2 only. I could have had a much more enjoyable experience on my trip if I picked up a 28mm f2 lens instead. To be fair to 7artisans, I think this lens is a great value, especially when I consider the fact that it can go to f1.4 at a wide focal length. Leica's equivalent isn't much lighter than this lens, so for the specs, it makes sense. If you're the kind of person who wants one of the fastest 28mm lenses on the market, and you do not care at all about how annoying this lens can be to carry, then it is a great option. It has a fun character to it, and it's built very well. For me, I personally underestimated the demands of my own use case and chose the wrong lens because it met the specs I thought I needed, but ended up not needing at all. This is a reminder that because something is great on paper does not mean it will fit your personal workflow. Thank you guys so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video and you want to help support the channel, I have added a limited run of some of my photos from Europe to my print shop. There are only going to be 10 of each photo, so if you're interested, head to the first link in the video description. See you next time.